Dr. Peter Daszak, you got very engaged in this whole question of public health and how do we deal with it. Can you explain what the EcoHealth Alliance is?
What we do at EcoHealth is we look at the connection between these viruses that are emerging and affecting public health and what is underlying that. And it turns out, and it's a bunch of research that we've done, but it turns out that almost all emerging disease are linked to some underlying driver, some cause that's related to people. It's things like travel and trade and building roads into forests around the world. We have this unprecedented population growth. We're doing things on the planet that we never used to do. We're building roads into the remotest forests. And what we do is we come into contact with wildlife species and pick up their viruses. What we do at EcoHealth is look at the relationship between people and animals and the environment and how that leads to pandemics. And we try and do something about it. You know, we do the science, and then we get on the ground in these places, and we've been working in China for 15 years, and we say, what is it that people are doing that's building a risk for them to pick up new diseases, that when those diseases happen, they always gravitate to the US, Europe, the countries that travel a lot. If we can deal with it there, we can stop it getting here.
So when you look at what's happened with coronavirus, what's your sense of how the Chinese have responded so far?
Well, if you compare it to what they did with SARS, it's orders of magnitude better. China's a very interesting country to me. When you're on the ground working with scientists, it's completely open and collaborative, just like working with US scientists. And they just want to do interesting work and publish it and make a name for themselves. But of course, at the same time, there's an authoritarian government that can move extremely quickly to close things down and to change policy. So what we've seen is those two things playing out. We've seen scientists at the very beginning of this outbreak finding the virus quickly, within 2 weeks, sequencing the whole genome of the virus and publishing it on the web. That would never have happened 20 years ago. The reason that's really important is because if we get that genetic sequence around the world, we can then design diagnostic tests to start testing people who are coming into the country. So that was a very good move. Then you've got the government coming in and doing what I think are actually very bold public health measures, like blocking travel within China during their Lunar New Year. I thought that was just such a strong move. But, of course, that's China. They have the capacity to do it, and the people will go along with that to some extent.
The coronavirus probably came from one of the food markets, although there is a sort of secondary rumor that there's a biological weapons laboratory in Wuhan, and it may have come from there. Is it your sense that it's almost certain that it came from an animal to human transmission?
All the evidence says that that's what happened. I mean, again, it's not as exciting as the movie release of a bioweapon, but the real bioterrorist out there is nature. We've got wildlife carrying, we estimate, 1.7 million unknown viruses in mammals alone. About 500,000 to 800,000 of those can probably infect us. We don't know what they are. We don't know where they are. It turns out that bats in China and all across Southeast Asia carry a whole host of probably pretty risky viruses. We've been out there discovering these new viruses. We've found 500 of them so far, including the closest relative to this one. It looks to me and to most scientists like it's a bat virus that got into people either in the market or in rural China and just unfortunately has the capacity to spread. We surveyed people in southwest China and found 2 to 3% of them had antibodies to bat viruses. They were exposed as a matter of course of everyday life in a very low level. But if you multiply that by 1.2 billion people, by people who intimately connect to wildlife through eating them and butchering them, you get a high risk, and eventually this thing is going to happen.
Is the bat genome so similar to ours that that's a major reason why it's able to be such a carrier and have such a leap across to humans?
That's a really good question. We know that HIV has a relationship with a chimpanzee virus, and we think that it probably came from chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are famously 99% similar to us. Bats are less similar, but if you look at the surface proteins of the cells, they have a receptor that these viruses can bind to, and it's very similar to the one that we have. surprisingly, bats are fairly close to us evolutionarily, enough for their viruses to sometimes be able to bind. And what we look at when we find a new virus in bats, we sequence the genes of the protein that binds to the cells, and we say, does that look like it could get into people? And this one can.
So how seriously do you take the coronavirus, given what looks like a relatively low fatality rate, at least so far?
I'm pretty optimistic about it, and optimism based on facts. Your point is right. The mortality rate is low. It's 2%, probably it may even drop, as we find that more people got mild infections. We just didn't know about them. Secondly, yes, this thing's spread out of China, and we've got cases here in the States and all around Europe and other countries, but those are controlled pretty well, and we're not seeing human-to-human transmission in countries outside China. That's a good thing. If that starts to happen and we see that travelers come into a country and seed a new epidemic, then you've got a real problem. I mean, I do worry a bit. When I look at a map of where this virus is, Africa and Latin America are just blank. And I just don't buy that. I think that there are probably people who have traveled to African countries from China who are infected and were just not caught yet. So we may see a few little clusters here and there, but I think that in 2-3 months, this will be on the way out, and I expect that in a year we won't be able to find this virus in people anymore around the world.
We keep having waves of viruses